Mists clung to the claws of Dragonstone as if the island wished to drown itself. The sea below kept its slow breath, the long black swell lifting and letting fall against the rocks, a whisper in a tongue older than kingdoms. Jon stood on the fortress steps, and the salt was already in his hair, a white dusting like an early promise of snow. When the wind shifted, he heard gulls and, farther off, the thrum and whir of wings that were not gulls, an unsettling sound that pulled the gaze upward whether one wished it or not. The sky was the color of iron quenched too quickly. Davos kept a step behind him, as steady as a winter hearth, and the men Daenerys had allowed to escort them waited at a distance, spears planted and eyes averted. The castle smelled of smoke and brine, that curious mingling of old heat and old water. A lithe, compact figure came down toward them with an ease that made the black steps look less menacing. Tyrion Lannister, his cloak pinned with a silver hand, the dwarf who spoke with a cut-purse wit and a judge's patience. He reached the last step and inclined his head in a gesture that was neither bow nor mockery but something precise and careful between. Then his mouth found its old curve. If Winterfell's air has frost, the air here has dragons. Both will sharpen a man's senses. My lord, no. Forgive me, your grace. Jon returned the nod. The last time he had seen this man, he had been a bastard with nothing to offer but a name that would not stick to him. Tyrion. It felt strange on his tongue. He had lived long enough to grow wary of names, how they changed in people's mouths. Thank you for receiving us. I've been receiving ships, ravens, invective, and unsolicited counsel since dawn, Tyrion said. It is a relief to receive someone I remember liking. Davos grunted. That's as close to a warm welcome as we'll get, I suppose. Ser Davos, Tyrion said with a flicker of something warm that might have been memory or simply the value he placed on competence. The sea brought you back again. Sensible of you to trust what you know. They crossed a courtyard where the stones radiated the day's meager heat as if hoarding it for a month without sun. Missandei passed with a ledger hugged to her ribs like a shield, her quiet greeting shaped by a smile that vanished as soon as duty tugged at it. Above them, one of the dragons sketched a dark arc, a shadowed thought across the clouds. The first time Jon had seen them, he had told himself not to stare. He had not succeeded then. He did not succeed now. Inside, the hall had been built to magnify flame and silence. A long table carved like a map waited beneath a rack of candles that threw unsteady light on the carved rivers and mountains, the scalloped lines of coasts and the knife strokes of passes. Tyrion gestured them toward it, as if he were offering a board for a game both of them knew was not a game. There's wine, he said, and poured without waiting for the answer, which was its own kind of courtesy. By the time you decide whether to accept, you'll have the cup in your hand. Jon warmed his hands around the cup before he remembered to drink. He did not come to drink. The man across from him had built his life on words. Jon had learned that sometimes the only words that mattered were the ones you did not want to say. He found them anyway. The dead are coming, he said. We need every spear, every hand. If the South falls to fevers and famine before the North is ready, we gain nothing. And yet every day I am told there's a queen in King's Landing who has no interest in the living's battles. Tyrion's mouth tightened, not in argument but in confirmation. Cersei has an abiding interest in Cersei, he said. Beyond that, her interests wander with her fears. She wears a crown like a helm. It protects her head and narrows her sight. Davos leaned on the map's edge and traced a finger along the Blackwater, the curling cut where the river kissed the bay. She's got the city and the gold, they say. Gold buys grain, Tyrion said. Until grain is not for sale, King's Landing is a throat that thirsts every sunrise. It was built to drink the riverlands and the reach. It eats through its stores as a man with a fever sweats through sheets. If we cannot take the city, perhaps we can teach its throat to close. Siege, Davos said, blunt as rope. Tyrion shook his head. A siege proclaims itself. It tells the city to suffer and see if help arrives. A siege awakens stubbornness. I mean something quieter and more cruel. And, since we live in a time rich in cruelty, perhaps something less bloody. Jon watched him, Tyrion drank, set down his cup, and reached for a small carved ship, a token no bigger than a thumb. He drew it up the coast from the arbor, balanced it on the edges of the mouth and the gullet as if the water made a thin blade of itself. "The city's belly trusts the sea," he said. "Wagons on roads are slow, love bridges, and the men who guard them are always hungry. Ships are faster, cheaper by distance, and harder to waylay. Grain from the Reach, fish from the north, especially whitefish and cod from White Harbor and the eastern fjords, spices and preserves from Essos. The crown pays in coin and promise. If ships discover they are better paid for turning their bows elsewhere and doing it quietly, the city wakes gagging. Cut comfort first, prices climb, then bread grows thin, then anger does what catapults cannot." Jon felt taste go from the wine. "You would starve the city. I would starve Cersei's war," Tyrion said. "Not the same thing unless she makes it so. There are ways to feed the mouths we must not lose, small, hidden ways. There are dockmasters who would look away for coin and a future birth, and bakers who will bake if flour arrives at their back doors. Ask me not to pretend this will be without pain. The choice is not between hurting no one and hurting someone. The choice is where to place it. And you, ask me to place it on small folk," Jon said. There was iron in the words even if he spoke them quietly. He pictured Winterfell's kitchens, the old women rolling out oatcakes with hands as knotted as roots. He saw in memory a boy with a wooden bowl, eyes on the ladle. "I ask you," Tyrion said, "to choose which war you mean to fight. If you send your spears south to batter at the Red Keep, the dead will find the wall less crowded. If you let Cersei spend her rage upon her own people, you will lose the people you would save. But if you starve her war quickly, the stubbornness cracks sooner. Riots begin as price and end as purpose. The City Watch often fights for whoever promises them more bread and less whipping. A clean siege is a lie we tell ourselves. We will build a dirty mercy." Davos's broken fingers tapped the map. "What sort of tools you mean to use for such work?" "Ravens," Tyrion said. "Promises. Gold borrowed and repaid in survival. Dorne's hatred put to a more useful use than theatrical revenge. Northmen who can hold water with as much patience as they hold ground. And one generous, enormous house in the north that already has salt in its blood." He slid the carved ship northward, a gliding move to White Harbor's mouth. "House Manderley. Lord Wyman has always been a realistic man inside his poetry. He can turn the harbor lights off for certain kinds of captains and on for others. He knows every fishing tongue from the Slaver's Bay to the Narrow Sea. He knows which barrels to leave uninspected." Jon's eyebrow rose despite the heaviness he felt. "You sound as if you've done half this before." "I did something like it to my sister once," Tyrion said, with the brittle humor of someone who has learned that family is a wound the past does not heal but only seals. "And she'd do worse to me. She will make a piece of theater when food grows lean. Hang some baker and call him a hoarder, or drown a cooper and call her a traitor. It will work for a while. Then the wrong bell will ring." "Dorne," Jon said. The word came out as if it had heat. The courtyard outside had let in the smell of hot stone. "You would rouse the Dornish spears. I would rouse them to escort, guard, and harry routes," Tyrion said. "Not to charge a gate of stone. Their captains are better at sand and suddenness than at standing a wall against scorpions. They can cut caravans on the Rose Road without declaring a war in the old manner. And from Sunspear I can ask that certain ships fly certain pennants and find welcome in certain coves. The Greenbloods plank towns raise oars quickly for the right profit and the right insult. If the sandship captains smell both together, they'll move like scorpions under sheets. They'd have to fight Euron's fleet," Davos said, uneasy as a sailor hearing a reef he could not place. "Or outdance it." "We cannot outfight an armada with dragons asleep on the cliffs," Tyrion said, "because there are other wars. We can teach ships to be small where Euron is large, to prefer fog to clear water, rocks to channels, and night to banners. He enjoys a battle that looks like a song. We'll give him a song with no chorus. Meanwhile, the North can turn off a spigot the city thinks is a spring. and Dorne can quietly break each wagon that thinks the road is honest. Jon watched the little carved ship settle near the white carved mouth of the Mander. He did not like the plan because it smelled like a trap set for a fox that would catch hounds and children both. But he had seen a thing the others had not, a wall of eyes blue as cruel winter, and he knew that mercy was a word without meaning when the world went cold. "You said bakers," he murmured. "What do we do for them?" Tyrion's gaze lifted. His eyes were softer than Jon remembered. "We will send flour to a handful of ovens that feed more mouths than the crown. Quietly, night, with men who'll lose their tongues if they speak. We will buy bread with gold and buy silence with fear. I won't pretend I am clean in this." "You won't have to," Jon said. Night took Dragonstone in layers like a cloak drawn and redrawn. Jon dreamt of Winterfell in snow that did not fall, of ravens whose wings were business, of a city with too many chimney mouths breathing into a starless dark. He dreamt of a woman with hair like a river of coal turning to ash at the edges, who looked at him as if she had seen him before in some other kind of world. When he woke, he heard the sea as a low iron drum. The next days were letters and whispers, ink-stained fingers and the peculiar weight of trust given in coin bags. Varys moved as if the hallways tried to keep him from leaving, his robes catching on edges of air, and yet he always appeared where a raven's beak was opening or a seal cooling. Missandei drew up lists of dockmasters and wrote their names as if to write were to bind them. Davos spoke with men who smelled of fish and old storms, and his voice had in it the tide's reason. It belongs, it returns. Tyrion wrote to Sunspear on paper thick as old vellum, hands so legible the page seemed to disagree with the words. To White Harbor he wrote words like hooks thrown into a deep green river, certain there were big shapes down there if you drew the lines just so. Jon added his name to letters where his name mattered, and sealed others with Winterfell's direwolf without believing that wax could deserve such a beast. Sansa's reply came with the speed of northern ravens and the stubbornness of a night that would not end. She had written in a hand that had become steadier without losing its elegance. She spoke of stores and the grumblings of men now called lords who only a year before had shouted his name. She spoke of the Vale and of Peter Baelish's eyes, which never quite looked where his words claimed they did. She told him Lord Wyman had put on weight and patience at the same time, which meant he was thinking. She reminded him, in a line that looked like a throat lifted to air, that starving a city meant starving people, not enemies. And yet below that she wrote another line, so small he had to hold the letter near the candle. "Remember the scale of the enemy you named." Lord Wyman's reply, when it came, arrived in a parcel that smelled faintly of smoked fish and ink that had dried in a damp place. He wrote more words than the matter required, as if language itself were a feast to him. He liked to speak of gulls and treaties with gulls' grandchildren. But beneath the gusts and jokes he set out terms in a calm, fat hand. White Harbor would make inspections, then make fewer. White Harbor would become suddenly mysterious when asked where certain shipments went. White Harbor would pay more attention to the health of its own fishermen and less attention to southern brokers. And White Harbor would require in return that Winterfell spend less breath on honor and more on oats. Grain from the Torrens Square hinterlands and from Barrowton's stubborn fields would be bought by the city and stored against winter, not sold to those who paid in bright southern coin and left their promises behind the way men leave small coins in seps. "My belly wishes me to tell you," Wyman wrote, "that a starving city cannot march to our wall even if it wants to, whereas a fed city can be made to wait. My heart tells me that a starving child is a starving child, whether its mother says, 'Your Grace' or 'M Lord.' My head tells my heart to be patient while the knives are out. I put my head on this letter and send it to you. Try not to cut it off." Sunspear's answer bore a seal that had last belonged to someone who would not use it again. The script was an elegant archipelago, sharp-inked, an island chain upon sand. Ilaria Sand wrote as if the page had wounded her once and she meant to wound it back. "You ask for our spears," she wrote. "You ask for our hate to dig quietly. You ask for us to be cunning. We are not unpracticed. My daughters will do as they do. I will bind them to two things: the thought of a dead girl who should have married and the promise that every wagon we break is a wagon that would have fed the woman who murdered her. I do not love this plan. I love little since the sands took Doran's patience from me. But I will make the road speak Dornish, and I will make the sea forget a few ships. Send me a list of captains who like darkness." Tyrion laughed once when he read that last line, a sound so human Jon could not help but like him for it. "They all like darkness when it hides them," he said, "and hate it when it hides their mistakes." Word went to Old Town's merchants in messages written by a bald man whose names changed with his cities, but whose ink always smelled faintly of blue flowers. Word went up the green blood on a skin boat that could be rolled up and hidden in a goat's pen. Word went quietly to the Hill of Rains where, if you asked the right man at the right twilight, you could buy a dozen honest seals and a dozen honest lies for a handful of coin and a better promise. Word went to a woman whom Tyrion called the widow with the wine in Volantis, who enjoyed whispering to captains that certain routes had become haunted by numbers. Word went to a lean man with an absent ring finger who had once served bread to princes and now had no particular taste for pomp. His eyes had a baker's seriousness, and he wore neutrality like a white apron. Then, because the sea's help is often a matter of wind and someone's mistake, the plan began to take root. In King's Landing, a baker named Mare woke in the blue hour to find men in brown cloaks standing in her doorway. She had no flour and no hope of it. In her window lay a wish of dust that could have been flour until she touched it and tasted salt. She had come to throwing rye into wheat to make the loaves pretend to be what they were not. The men smiled with their eyes and said nothing. They left 3 sacks which their shoulders should not have been able to carry without bending low. She knew enough to be afraid of gifts. She had lived through a king who played at martyrdom with other people's bread. But in one sack, beneath the top layer, she found a small bag with a wolf stamped clumsily in wax. Under the wolf was a short line in a hand that could have belonged to a maester before wine soured it. "For the ones who do not bow to anyone, feed them." Mare did not bow to anyone because her spine had become a question mark and then, later, an answer. She made bread. She sent loaves out her back door to those who knocked a certain way. She began to pay her rent in silence. On the Rose Road, wagons went as if nothing had changed until, on a dawn with a wind like a sigh, something had. The first raids were brutal and short, the work of spear points and good information. A column of 20 wagons with plodding oxen made easy meat for 10 lean riders who knew the roadside stands of thorn and when hooves made their own music. Thorinks were cut from harnesses and sent into fields. Barrels burned. Men who wore the Lannister red fought, and then 3 of them were taken away alive and none of them spoke, and one of them hung himself in a tent with a rope he pretended not to have. The raiders were there and gone, and a mile farther on a shepherd watched the smoke with a face that had forgotten how to expect help. At the Mander's wide mouth, where the river ran into its sea like a lord returning home, House Redwine's ships kept their lines tight and their oars disciplined, at least on the days when the oarsmen hadn't sold messages to someone else. A galley that had left Old Town with flour, wine, candles, and a few crates labeled dried fish, turned back when a fisherman paddled up with a sore tale about rocks newly grown where there had never been rocks. The captain, who had slid his coin purse under his belt 3 times that morning in nerves, cursed rocks. He lifted his hand to order a new tack. Then he thought of the way the fisherman, and had not looked him in the eye. He went on anyway. The galley grounded on a shoal no chart had ever confessed, and by nightfall those barrels were rolling soundlessly onto a deeper-keeled ship that had been hiding in the lee of the shields, a ship whose captain knew how to love a fog's touch. Euron Greyjoy sent 3 of his sloops into the gullet to teach it to stop swallowing ships without his permission. The men drank and sang and pissed on their own decks into the wind as if to piss on the world. They found a fishing fleet instead, 20 little cogs that wore patched sails and smelled of the kind of work that makes a man's hands into knots. The Ironborn laughed and reached for torches, and then a spark of panic ran down the last of the daylight as a line of low rocks rose where none had been before, and the first sloop was kissing stone, and then the second, and then small, happy boats that were meant to be slow were suddenly quick, because they did not fear to put their bellies in water 3 feet deep where a proud sloop abhors it. The fishermen sang nothing. They cut nets, snagged rudders, and slid away. 2 sloops limped south, their sailors shouting lines that felt like insults in their mouths because rocks do not bleed. The third burned as night made a mirror of the bay, and the flames on water looked like a festival no one had planned. Varys's little birds took to carrying messages about prices and about children. "A loaf costs this much in Flea Bottom," they wrote, making the numbers look like crooked puppets dancing. "A soldier took this much from me and called it tax." One wrote in a careful, slightly proud hand, "I saw a cart full of flour stop at the Red Keep." Another wrote, less proud. The letters shook as if the child's wrist had not been ready for what it had seen. Varys read and said little. He snipped the most dangerous lines into pieces and threw them into the brazier as if he were feeding the fire with things it did not deserve, the heat that melts iron cooking paper like fat. In the Red Keep, Qyburn measured the city as if it were an animal he half wished to heal and half wished to take apart. He reported to Cersei in words that had no misplaced syllables. "People are restless. There are gatherings at the steps. Prices move like startled birds. The watch's pay must be raised if we want them to sing the songs we ask for. The Baker Guild speaks insolently through their chosen man. It would be wise to hang 3 and then negotiate with their widows." His eyes did not betray the slow bloom of excitement he felt when people became systems that could be cut and stitched. Cersei listened, leaning back on the lion of her chair. Paranoia had become her skeleton. It held her up and made her stand too straight. Her hair had grown back in a ruthless crop that marched like wheat but could not feed anyone. She smiled without kindness. "Raise the watch's pay," she said. "Then have them pay it back in loyalty. Hang 1 baker for every sack that disappears. Set the prices so the small folk understand the world is firm. And tell Euron that if he wants my bed, he can start by finding who thinks I am deaf as well as blind." Jaime watched her profile and thought, not for the first time, that the gods had taken his hand as a joke and left his heart to make him laugh too loud at it. He did not say that bread does not grow from threats. He had learned the use of silence with Cersei. It soothed her like a warm cloth on a fevered forehead, even when the fever did not pass. He spent his words on letters to Ser Island about stricter patrols, on questions to the quartermaster about grain stores, and on watchful pauses in the yard while the mountain breathed heavily the way a forge bellows does when rust has set in. In Winterfell, Sansa met with men who called her lady, in tones that mixed respect, fear, desire, and greed in a ratio that told her much about them. The great hall's smoke sketched the beams like priors drawing maps of sin. She sat on the high seat only when speaking to the kind of men who needed height to understand weight. The rest she spoke to on the same level, and that made them more nervous. She wrote to White Harbor reminding Wyman that men with too much time turn their swords toward their neighbors and their rumors toward the person they can see. She told him to keep his harbor busy, even if it was with fishing boats that sailed 1 mile out and then returned with nothing but a rumor of a shoal. Busy men erred less. She wrote to the smaller houses with words that made their pride feel like a well-worn cloak. "We remember, we endure, we feed our own." She sent a quiet rider to a village where a grange had a roof missing the same 3 shingles it had missed last year. She had a new roof put on with payment and a story. This roof was bought with grain that would have gone to men who burned your cousin's barns. She did not believe stories healed. She believed they kept wounds from gaping open when you moved too quickly. Arya came like a quiet that had teeth. She did not tell anyone she had returned until she wanted to. She stood in Sansa's doorway and looked like a child and a knife at once. Sansa's breath left her, then came back with the sense that some part of the world had been returned with a high interest. They did not speak of father's head. They did not speak of mother's throat. Sansa told her what Jon planned, and Arya made a face that complicated itself 3 times before becoming plain. "I will go to King's Landing," Arya said, as if saying she would go to the well. "They will not be able to say who starved them. They will say it was a woman no one saw. They will build a story that makes them feel less foolish." "You will not kill Cersei," Sansa said, and she heard in her own voice an echo of a woman who had once believed in contest rules. "Not if it means the city burns. Not if it means we lose Jaime's better part or Tyrion's. We need both. Not if it means we lose Daenerys when winter breaks the shore." Arya smiled with all the patience of someone who has learned that rules are just another blade. "There are other throats," she said. "Some men who take from poor mouths have good reputations. I will make a few bad reputations. And I can take notes on prices. I can carry bread and count coins and listen to men who boast when they've had wine. I'm very good at being no one." When she left, Sansa sat very still. The wind around the towers had started to sing in a way that meant a storm would come at a day's remove. She put her hands on the furs in her lap and tried to find a warmth in them that was not just animal. In her chest, a map of people she loved moved their small pieces. On the Boneway, Obarasand led 15 to their work with a spear as casual as a lady holds a fan. She did not like carrying letters. She liked to pound messages into men. But Tyrion's plan had a nasty grace to it she could respect. She sent riders ahead to cut reins and come back with reins cut into pieces. She sent one to the wrong village with a rumor and paid for it with a cut throat that would turn someone's mother into a weeper. Nymeria preferred talking. She took twice as long to break a caravan and killed no one if she could help it, but somehow always stole the right 4 barrels. Tyene found a priest who blessed wagons and blessed his purse and blessed his mistress and then blessed her until he realized he had been robbed blind of his sense of security. And Ilaria, who loved words better than she loved silence and loved her daughters like knives loves whetstones, stayed at Sunspear writing instructions and apologies she had no intention of sending. The city began to complain before it began to starve. Complaints are the first shivering. People moaned into their cups and their wives' hair. The maids who carried water laughed less because jokes require sugar. The men who trued wheels cursed the wood as if wood had decided to be stubborn on its own. The King's Guard changed horses more often because going through crowds took longer, and the horses hated it and refused to step where a pot had overboiled. A boy threw a stone at a tax collector and thought he'd thrown it gently. It broke the man's nose with a soft noise, like fruit splitting when it is too ripe. The city watch put 3 men in stocks and called them extortionists, and their wives brought them loaves stolen from the baker's guild as if to prove a point, and the loaves smelled like rye pretending to be better wheat. Mare fed 40 people a day. She did not count them because counting invited envy. Envy makes wrecks. She cut loaves carefully so the cuts did not look deliberate. She learned 3 knocks, 1 fast, 1 slow, 1 like an impatient dog. The first belonged to children. The second belonged to the old. The third belonged to the men who would fight if they got bread and would fight if they didn't, so you would rather they got bread. She had flour under her nails and flour in her hair and flour in her lungs. She dreamed of a white that was not snow and woke coughing. Once, a boy put a copper on her table and said, "My mother said to pay you or the gods will see." She put the copper in her apron and wished she had a god. Jaime met with the antler men, who wore their pride like antlers into rooms where antlers did not fit. He warned them to keep the river open. He promised to escort wagons. He did not promise to save their heads if the queen needed to throw one downstairs to see if it would bounce. He saw too clearly the past to pretend to anyone he did not. On his way back to the Red Keep he saw a boy with a butcher's apron eyeing soldiers the way a hawk eyes rabbits, and he recognized something in the boy. Some long, lean hunger that has nothing to do with bread. "Don't," Jaime said, and the boy looked at him as if men in gold had ever saved him from anything. Varys put his hands together as if in prayer after the 1000th message about prices, then opened them and let light from the window fall into the cup of them. "We must feed the children," he said to Tyrion, to Missandei, to Jon, to Davos, "or this becomes a story about monsters wearing banners." "Already is," Davos said, "but we can sew the mouth shut." Missandei's voice was precise. "We can send sacks to bakers, not to the guild. The guild has pride and will ask under whose authority they receive it. Pride bleeds faster than flesh." "And sooner," Tyrion said. "We cannot bleed pride yet. We need it to keep the guild master speaking where we can hear. We will feed the ovens that feed quietly. Varys, tell your friends that the price on flour is a lie that will go lower if certain names are not shouted from steps. Davos, find 3 captains who know the dark side of the moon and can make a ship's belly look like a fisher's wife. Jon, tell your sister to keep the north calm. If the north panics, Cersei wins twice. We doom the city and lose our wall." Jon wanted to ride for Winterfell that moment, as if winter itself would be offended if he spent too much time in a hall built for dragons. He did not. He told Sansa to keep sending small news. A calf born too early and saved by stew. A hearth that caught and was put out with ale. A child who learned to say his name and would not stop saying it because he liked how it sounded. These were the opposite of reports. They kept men from turning into numbers. The Iron Bank's emissaries arrived at the Red Keep like coffins that had learned to walk. They smiled with lips that moved but eyes that did not. Cersei showed them a ledger that began with numbers and ended in threat. They showed her a list of names in the Reach who were suddenly more reluctant to do business in a city whose bread had begun to taste of bargains. She said they were cowards. They said cowards make excellent business partners when fed. She promised them gold from Highgarden's vaults, and they smiled with more mouth teeth. It's time. They left with more gold than they had come with and made a quiet promise to themselves that they would not be the last to leave if the wind changed and the city began to smell like ash. In Old Town, a novice in the Citadel read a missive he should not have and thought about ships for the first time in his life as if they were animals with hearts. He walked down to the quay and told a captain that a storm would come. Not weather but storm, and the captain nodded because the boy looked like he had learned to be afraid the right way. The captain delayed, then sold his cargo to a broker who came from nowhere and had no name and a purse that made a noise like rain. The broker walked away with a slow gait that made him look shorter than he was. Later that night, he wrote a letter in a hand that belonged to no city. The prices in King's Landing went up the way people get old. At first it was a joke, then it became a habit, then it became a fight at the door of a shop. People stopped buying candles and forgot why darkness felt like a friend. The docks began to stink of idle wood. A fishmonger replaced his sign with one that said, "Closed for prayer," and went home to count the thinness of his children. The city watch took to smacking bread lines when they grew loud, and bread lines began to carry rocks without quite meaning to. A woman who had been a brewer 3 kings ago took a bad barrel of cheap ale and served it to 2 gold cloaks who laughed and drank and called the brewer mother, as if they had seen their mothers lately. In the morning one of them did not wake and the other did, and then screamed until his throat was blood when he realized his friend had stopped being a man and turned into a waif. Cersei stood at a window that had seen dragons once and refused to remember. She watched a line of people moving like a slow river, then thought of the wildfire that still slept somewhere beneath the city like an old shame. She turned away and told Qyburn to find her solutions. She told Jaime to hold the Rose Road, the Gold Road, any road with a name, which is to say, none. She told Ser Bronn of the Blackwater to go make himself useful where the smell of coin was thickest. He saluted with the indifference of an old cat and went. She told Euron that she expected a present made of ships. He grinned like a wounded thing and made a story about how he would bring her the world on a rope. She poured wine. It did not taste like victory. Tyrion stood on Dragonstone's parapet one morning and counted. It had always been one of his small gifts, to turn men and grain into numbers and to let numbers become men again at the last moment so he did not grow into a kind of monster. He counted ships accountable to a plan that had no pride in itself. He counted gates he wanted closed and mouths he could not afford to have open. He counted mistakes already made and set them in a line to see which had children. He counted all the insults his name had collected and chose 3 to answer in gold and 7 to leave unanswered because answers create appetite. He counted the years of his life and came up with different sums depending on whose life he tried to live inside. For a moment it overwhelmed him, the sheer arithmetic of hope and harm. He put his hand on the black stone and felt the old heat of old fire. Jon joined him and said nothing. They had learned to like silence together. "I do not believe in victories that look clever on paper," Jon said finally. "I believe in keeping the men next to me alive long enough for them to call me fool again. Yet I think this may break her faster than rams against her gates." "It will break something," Tyrion said. "We must guide what breaks. When a city begins to believe the crown cannot feed it, the crown becomes a story. People will reach for a new story. The most dangerous thing we can do is not give them anywhere to reach." "Give them winter," Jon said dryly. "Give them a messenger who does not look like a conqueror," Tyrion said. "Give them a promise that when the cold comes, and it will, someone will remember their names. We can ask the bakers to write small prayers on their loaves." We can send a few scraps of information to men in the Watch who are less loyal to gold than to their pride in being the city's shield. We can let them feel that they, and not we, will save their streets. Varys can do that, Jon said. He has saved more streets than kings have burned. Tyrion nodded once, grateful and a little ashamed. And you, your grace, can write to Cersei and tell her that if she comes north to talk, you will not murder her. She won't believe you. She'll believe that people will hear you said it. Sometimes that is the same thing. So she knows bread disappears and my name appears, Jon said. Good. I want her thinking of me when she eats. He wrote to her, and he wrote to Jaime, and he wrote to no one in particular by putting words into ravens' mouths and letting them fly. His letter to Jaime was the smallest. A single sentence that said, "Once you kept your oath when breaking it meant saving men." He did not say which men. He did not have to. Arya, wearing another woman's face and a manner like a purse that does not look worth stealing, learned that a man named Corbin on the River Row kept a ledger of the bakers who cheated him and the guards he bribed to be lenient when they caught a cart without the right stamp. She read the ledger and burned it and put her own ledger in its place with names spelled twice wrong, so that he would bring it to a clerk who would look at it and frown and begin to wonder if he had been made a fool. She followed a man who stole flour and watched him give it to a septon with hands like a fisherman, and she let him do it. She stood in a doorway and watched a riot begin and end, watched the city gather itself into a fist and then think better of it because someone had rolled out 2 barrels from a side door and said nothing. She what? Ched, a baker's wife, beat a gold cloak with a shoe and not be killed, and she decided that someone had given an order somewhere that forbade killing women that day. She did not know if the order came from Jaime or from a watch sergeant who did not want to explain to a crowd why a mother's blood was on his hands. It did not matter whose mouth moved. It mattered that the crowd went home with a story that wasn't defeat. The famine did not arrive as a single thing. It arrived piecemeal. Fewer onions, more weeping, a bitter taste in beer that you could blame on the barley or on memory. It arrived in men who looked at slices and lied to themselves about how thick they had once been. It arrived in old women who said, "I have eaten worse," and meant it, but their voice broke because meaning something is not the same as bearing it. It arrived in a dog that learned 3 new kinds of beg and a butcher who learned he did not like himself very much. It arrived with Qyburn weighing men's tongues in his mind and Cersei setting the balance with a thumb. When wolves are hungry, they look for the weakest of the herd. Clear policies do the same. The Crown cracked down on the dockside liberties and found the liberties more like a habit than a place. People began to move in streams that could not be dammed by orders. A rumor went from mouth to mouth that a man with scarred hands had opened a warehouse and given out bread with no questions, and the rumor moved faster than men on horses, and when the Crown Guard came to see, they found a warehouse and a door, and behind the door a new wall, and behind the wall a pile of sawdust stacked cleverly under old cloth to look like sacks. Someone had learned carpentry in this war. Someone had learned theater. Bronn reported back with dirt under his nails and a bag that clinked. "You can hit a caravan," he told Jaime. "You can't hit hunger. It makes more of itself. If you want to stop it, you need to stop the mind that made it." He looked at the gold with the disappointment of someone who has lost enthusiasm for gold and suspects that means he has grown old. "We can hunt the sand snakes until we've killed every one, and they'll still have cousins. We can hunt Varys's birds, and they'll use mice. We can hang bakers, but in a week there won't be bread because bakers will stop being bakers." Jaime rubbed a thumb along a nick in his breastplate, thinking of battle as craft and of how craft fails when the wood is rotten. "So," he said, "don't hang bakers. Hang no one for a month. My sister will be furious." "She's furious now," Bronn said. "Furious women do often as much harm to themselves as to their enemies if you let them tire themselves out." "You have not known my sister," Jaime said without humor. He remembered a girl who had smiled as if smiling were power and then had learned it was. He thought of his hand on the rope that had pulled the door of the throne room wide and had made him a name that smelled like treason. He had saved a city once. He did not much like cities, but he did not enjoy lighting them on fire either. "I will try to keep men from killing men for the next 10 days. After that we will see if bread appears or whether the gods enjoy watching me fail." Bread appeared in mean loaves that a dog would suspect. Bread appeared in honest loaves that tasted of a northern autumn and made old men weep because tears are a seasoning you cannot buy. Bread appeared in mares' palms and in the mouths of children whose mothers had learned to scold as if scolding were a blessing. Bread appeared in a sept that had been half burned down once and rebuilt by hands that did not know how to lay stone true and did it anyway. People ate not enough but something. People said one sentence more each day that was not a curse. The watch learned to look one way while a cart went another, because some of them had wives who had visited a certain baker, and this was how the city saved itself, by small, corrupt mercies. Euron came back with 2 galleys and a new song about rocks that move without asking, and Cersei listened and did not laugh because to laugh is to feed something in a man like that. She sent him anyway. She always would. He fought a battle he could win off Fair Isle and sent 100 men into the sea with stones tied to their ankles and called it poetry. It had nothing to do with bread. It made his crew forget bread for a week. A week is a handful of heartbeats when your city is counting loaves. At White Harbor, Wyman Manderley presided over a table that groaned not under meat but under maps. He took pride in looking at a map the way he looked at a goose before carving it. He respected bone. He sent 4 ships out with new names that were old names turned backward, which amused him. He sent polite letters to Old Town that said, "We admire your knowledge and your cats and your towers," and he sent impolite letters to Halifax and never signed them. He told his granddaughter to learn to read a coastline like a face. He sent men in small boats to whisper to fisherfolk in little coves 2 days' walk from any inn. He told the blackfish's name to the sea as a wish and laughed at himself for it. And when a night came down warm and wet and his joints swore at him, he sat with Davos and told an old joke 3 times until Davos laughed despite himself and the room got lighter. "What we're doing," Davos said that night, "it only looks like stealing if you consider breath a property." "It is," Wyman said mildly. "It belongs to the living. The dead are awful collectors." In Sunspear, Illyria stood under a fig tree that had not asked to grow where it did and thought of how often the world refuses to ask. She missed the habit of love more than she missed its object. She received word that Obara had stabbed a man's shadow and frightened a dozen men more than she had harmed one. The rumor grew like yeast. She received word that Nymeria had taken a caravan and left the women th coin and a story that made them heroes in their own yard. She received word that Tyene had cried at a man's funeral and made 3 children eat, and she wondered what revenge was, in markets of shadow and bread. She wrote to Tyrion a line she had not expected to write. "I do not like you, but this cuts cleaner than most knives I have tried." Tyrion sat with that letter in his lap as if it were heavier than it was. He found himself imagining the face of a woman who would write those words and realized he had too often imagined faces that then became monsters. He put the letter away. He wrote back that the knives must keep cutting for 2 more months, then 3. He wrote that the signal to slow would be a raven with no seal and 1 word. Long. He wondered if he could buy even that much quiet from Winter. He wondered if Winter took bribes. The first riot that truly wanted to become a fire began with a speech. A man with a loud voice and a good hat shouted about bakers and crowns and who deserves what from whom. He used the word rights, which is a city word and a dangerous one. A woman shouted back about her 2 sons and a husband who had not come back from the Blackwater. A boy threw a stone. A gold cloak fell and did not rise. 3 men pressed forward with knives made from barrel hoop iron. Then 20 loaves appeared in arms that pretended they had always existed in that crowd, and someone shouted about bread being given if people would go home, and no one believed it, and then someone tasted it and said, "It's good." And that was the most persuasive speech made in the city that day. People took loaves, and some fought for them, and half of those broke the loaves in half and passed the halves back, and the crowd learned something about itself and then dispersed because the world had turned back to small tasks. Qyburn watched from a balcony and said to himself that an experiment had had an outcome. He did not decide yet what to try next. Jaime found Tyrion's letter and read it under a candle until wax fell in little white mountains on the table. He had read his brother's words over years the way some men read prayer books, for the difference a few letters can make in the shape of a day. He wrote back nothing. He would not make a plan with the circle of ink telling him where to stand. he did something else. He went to the commander of the watch, a stocky man with a broken nose and a sense of his own dignity that befit no one in the uniform, and said quietly, "If you kill another baker, I will cut your head off where you stand, and I will tell the queen the baker drew a knife first and you were a traitor. Do not test me." "On what grounds?" the commander said, wounded by the notion he could be ungrounded. "On the grounds that I am full," Jaime said, "and I will not become hungry like the city." The commander stared and then, miraculously, bowed and walked away. It changed less than it should have. It changed more than Jaime believed it would. The watch turned their attention to smugglers wearing arrogance as if it were armor and learned, to their surprise, that smugglers are more useful than arrogant men when you want a city to wake without killing 3 of its teeth. Tyrion went to Daenerys and told her the shape of a war without banners. She listened, her eyes like bright stones at a ford. She had fire sleeping on her island. Her dragons had grown as inevitable as storms. "I can burn the Red Keep," she said, and her voice when she said burn made the candles think of going out. "I can make them kneel and be done." "You can," Tyrion said, "and then you will rule ashes. The ashes will consent to anything. The living will not. The North will not. He will not." He did not gesture toward Jon because she knew. "We will win better if they topple their queen for bread than if we push her from a window. Bread rots slower than fear." She looked at Jon and did not have to say a thing to ask the question only she could ask. "How much will you let me be a dragon if I keep my flames on their leashes?" Jon said, "Be what saves us. Else the dead do not care whose queen burned which city." It was an answer and not a comfort. Some days Tyrion believed that was the best one could do and remain human. Winter made its first true step into the city in a late afternoon with white breath like a field of ghosts. People shivered and said, "Ah," as if recognizing a friend who always arrives drunk. The bakers' ovens became gods. The smoke from chimneys became banners no one fought under. The prices jumped, then stabilized like a skittish horse that lets you touch its neck. Jon stood on the wall of Dragonstone and inhaled, and the air bit him like a dog that has learned both to protect and to punish. The Pact had changed the city's heartbeat. The wagons came and went, fewer, slower, watched with 100 eyes. The ships slipped where a larger fleet could not follow, and men in little boats became kings for 20 minutes at a time. Dorne's spears learned patience from the North's snows. The North's captains learned cunning from Dorne's heat. Grain went around King's Landing as if it were a rock in a river. Some of it dripped through. Tyrion had ordered it. More of it did not. That was the point. It made enemies in 2 directions. It could have made a third if Daenerys had let herself judge the kind of plan that keeps dragons chained. Then there came the breaking that was not fire. It arrived as a made thing, like a letter. The City Watch arrested 6 men who had met in a cellar and called themselves a council. It was a foolish council. It was also a prophecy. Men meet in cellars when they think the ceilings are safer than the sky. The Watch dragged them into the light and would have hanged them as traitors if the crowd had not done a simple thing: turned away and refused to watch. Hangings require an audience the way theater does. The Watch hanged them anyway. The bodies spun a little. A woman under a bonnet did not cry. She took bread from a small boy's hand and gave it to an old man with more bones than flesh. And the Watch went home and told their wives that the city did not look them in the eye today. Something had changed. Jaime wrote to Tyrion, "Stop hurting them as soon as she begins to hurt herself. You will know when. There will be a day when she speaks to no one for longer than is polite, and when she refuses wine she does not refuse. If you keep pressing past that day, you will turn the crowd from hunger to hate. Hunger is a blade. Hate is a fire. I can guard against one more than the other." Tyrion read this and put a finger on the map where King's Landing sat like a fat tick. He did not know if his brother was honest or if his brother had found a way to make loyalty to his sister look like advice. He made another set of calculations and told Varys to slow the whispers that made dockmasters snarl at the crown. He told Davos to send 3 shipments straight through the Narrows with banners that claimed nothing and still found a way to declare food. He told Illyria to bloody the road one last time and then clean her spear. The last time came on a hard sky morning. Obara pierced a barrel and watched flour. Real flour, white as a false tooth, spill into the road and turn to paste in a small puddle, and she sighed as if the gods had brought her to a city she did not like and told her to like it anyway. She kicked a man who had lied about how much he carried and rode away. Nymeria left a wagon untouched because she recognized the woman sitting inside it. She had seen her 2 weeks before with a sick child, and she was not so in love with plans that she would make that woman's day worse for the sake of a letter from a man with a wet quill. Tyene sat under a tree and listened to the silence that comes after men refuse to get up and try again. She did not like it, but she respected it like a form of courage she had not found a use for in herself. The pressure eased. The city noticed before the crown did. People who do not live by counting felt the ground under their feet grow less slanted. The bakers slept a little. Mare watched her sack stay sacks for 3 days running and felt her chest loosen as if a hand had stopped pressing on it. The watch found themselves praised in a rumor that said they had stopped the hangings, which was not precisely true and precisely useful. Jaime drank wine that night and did not taste ash at the bottom of the cup. Cersei glared at numbers and at a ledger that had become a lying friend and wanted to kill someone precise but could not find them. Tyrion stood at the table again and felt the difference like a line cut and then tied. "Now we wait," he said. And he hated the sentence because it was the most southern sentence he knew. The North did not wait. It endured. We watch for the second riot. We watch for our ravens to come back with their feathers burned. We watch for the day Cersei proposes some grand gesture to prove she is not afraid of bread. Then we give her that gesture, and we turn it into a rope. "What gesture?" Jon asked. "The one pride suggests," Tyrion said, and he almost smiled sadly. "She will march. She will lead men with empty bellies out of the city to seize a symbol, a granary under our hand, a ferry we have turned against her, a bridge we keep. She cannot stand to stay behind her walls and look afraid. When she marches, the watch will march, and some of them will not want to, and while she is gone, the city will think about what life feels like without her. We will not fight a battle for a gate. We will let people think about doors and whether they want them to open to her again." "She'll take hostages," Davos said. He said it like a man weighing an anchor. "She'll try," Tyrion said. "We will try to make sure they are the wrong ones. We will try to make sure they are men who realize, halfway down the road, that they are not paid enough to die of hunger in the service of someone else's fear." When it came under a hard blue sky that made everything look like it had been sharpened. Voices, lines of roofs, the white line of smoke from an oven that hadn't yet realized a war runs on yeast. Cersei rode in black that shone, a mirror of the fear she refused the world. Jaime rode beside her in a compromise between duty and neighborliness. The watch followed in rows that looked like a plan. There were fewer than there might have been, more than there should have been. The people lining the street did not cheer. Some did not even look. That was an accusation. That was a beginning. They went out the river gate. They went along the river where reeds whispered dangerously. They crossed a small bridge that had been rebuilt 3 times in 5 years and each time worse, and everyone felt the way it rocked under the horses. They went to a granary that rumor said held flour enough to make the city stop complaining for a month. The rumor had a name and a wife and 2 children. It had a face. It was a rumor because Varys had decided reality was too honest and needed a little fiction to make it move faster. There were men there, more than the queen liked, fewer than a battle would require. There were no banners. That was the trick of it. People fight banners. They avoid neighbors. When you fight neighbors, you must tell yourself a story about why the face you see is an emblem and not a person. Cersei tried to tell herself such a story. The watch looked at the men in front of them and saw, to their disgust, faces that had bought them ale once. The first charge was a mess. The first scream was old. 2 men died. A sack of flour burst, and the wind took it and shook it over the field so it looked for a moment like a blessing had come and then like a blinding. Jaime held the line and ordered a fallback so clean even anger might have applauded the craftsmanship. He looked at Cersei and saw that her mouth had gone white where it went Art. He turned his horse and put it between her and a man with a pitchfork who had persuaded himself that killing a queen looks like stabbing wheat. There was a moment where the whole world sat very still and considered becoming tragedy. Then the wind took a breath and put flour in the man's eyes, and he stumbled and dropped the pitchfork, and the world decided on humiliation instead, which is more survivable. They did not take the granary. They took 2 sacks and a man whose name was Tom, and who had thought himself ready to die that morning and decided halfway through the second scream that he was not ready at all. They turned back. The people did not cheer when they returned. No rotting vegetables flew. Silence fell into the line like a stone. That night, in the Red Keep, Cersei broke 2 cups and did not weep. Jaime told her nothing of his feelings. Qyburn held counsel with watches and words and came away certain of only one thing. The city had begun to think of itself as separate from its queen, and that is a thought even kings have trouble welding shut. Tyrion found Varys in a narrow room that had never had a name and looked like a place where plans go to apologize. "Now," Tyrion said, with all the weariness of a man who has built a careful violence and watched it work. "Now we whisper to the watch that a door could stay closed. Now we ask bakers to bake an extra loaf and the watch to pretend not to see it. Now we remind people, gently, that the red in the Red Keep is not their color." "And what of the queen?" Varys asked, polite as a cat asking whether milk remains. "She will do something," Tyrion said. "She cannot tolerate a world that thinks without her. She will try to frighten them into loving her. We will ask them whether fear tastes like bread or like ash." Jon wrote to Sansa and said, "There will be a moment in the city when a door is asked to stay closed. If it opens, we will have to talk to a dragon about fire. If it stays closed, we will ask for men to come north to fight a war with no breadlines." And Sansa wrote back, "I will send men to be near Moat Cailin and to keep the path safe for those who choose to march. I will send stories about the ones who arrive so their names are not lost." And she told the kitchens to prepare gruel and pride in equal measures. The door was a small one in a big wall. It had once been a craftsman's dream of joinery and had become, over decades, a tired compromise between wood and men who wanted through it quickly. On a day when the wind had knives in it, 2 sergeants and a dozen men stood there with tired faces and insults in their pockets. A woman came and handed them a basket with bread and said nothing. A boy came to stare at the men's swords as if they were the last magic left in the world. Then a captain came with a writ that said in handsome letters the gate would open to let the queen pass to do something noble on the far side. The writ did not mention bread. The captain smiled at the men like an uncle who has been in his cups. The sergeant took the writ. He could not read, but he had spent a life reading faces. He looked at the men behind him and saw they did not want to open the door. He looked at the city behind him and saw it did not want them to open the door. He looked at himself and found he did not want to open the door. He said without rage, "No." The captain sputtered. He had a speech. He had 2. He waved the writ. The men stepped back a single pace. The sergeant imagined the queen's mouth when she heard. He imagined his head on a spike. He also imagined his daughter eating bread that did not taste of more water than flour. He imagined nothing else and let the 2 images balance themselves precariously and then become a decision. "No," he said again. "We're hungry." Somewhere else in the city, an old woman smiled and said, "Ah," as if she had put a pot on when she heard someone in the lane. People began to tell each other about a door that had not obeyed. The watch found in itself something like a spine not paid for with coin. Cersei's orders turned into shouts, then into punishments executed on men who had not been at that door and could not explain why the door had become a word. Jaime told her that doors open and close every day, and she hissed at him a truth sharper than a blade. "Not this one. Not to me." Under Dragonstone's sky, in air that tasted of snow on salt, Tyrion and Jon and Davos watched the horizon. They did not wait for dragons. They had become a new kind of soldier, men who counted bread and thought about doors. A raven came with a single paper tied to its leg. One word on it in a hand that made the word look longer than it was. Long. Tyrion exhaled a laugh that was almost grief. "We slow," he said. "We feed more. We hold the knife by the least harmful edge. We ask the watch to keep saying no, and we reward them with nothing but the feeling that their wives love them a little more." Jon nodded. In him something untwisted. It did not undo what hunger had done to people he did not know. It did not undo what he would ask of men soon. But it made a shape of mercy into which he could pour his will. Now we ask them to come north, he said. Not all. Those who can. Men who carry spears. Men who carry bread. We ask them to fight for themselves in a winter that has no queen and no bakers. Sansa received men with frost in their beards and hunger in their eyes and pride in their backs. She gave them food and a place in lines that would hold, and she wrote down their names and said them out loud like charms. Arya slipped among them and stole nothing because some days to steal is to break something, and she had enough broken in her. Davos stood on the docks of White Harbor and watched ships come in low in the water from carrying more hope than cargo. Wyman Manderley laughed and cried and ate too much and promised to eat less and did not. In the Red Keep, Jaime stood at a window and watched a city that learned a new trick, to care for itself when its queen did not. It would not last forever. Nothing does. But it had lasted long enough for something else to gather in the north. Something that moved like memory and thunder when you are still. Cersei drank wine and said, "They will remember I fed them." Jaime did not say what he knew. That they would remember who had not taken their bread away when they needed it most. The mountain stood behind her, breathing. He was the shape fear takes when it cannot think of a prettier face to wear. Tyrion wrote one last letter to Jaime without sending it. He wrote, "I tried to starve your war and not your city. If I failed, it is because wars eat cities for breakfast. If I succeeded, it is because people choose bread over banners." He folded the letter and put it into a brazier's flame and watched a page's worth of guilt become nothing but heat. He hoped guilt turned to something more useful when breathed by cold men in cold places. Snow began to fall on Dragonstone. This was a phenomenon with the etiquette of a dream, out of place and yet insisting on its right to be. Sentries watched flakes melt on stone made from old fire. Jon looked north because he did not know how to look elsewhere when winter spoke. He felt the pact as a weight and as a breath. Dorne's spears now pointed toward a road. It had turned a baker into a priestess and a sergeant into a kind of judge. It had made enemies of numbers and allies of faces. Tyrion counted fewer ships now and more people. Davos learned the names of 2 boys who would go north with their father because their mother was dead, and they had been fed by a woman who had given them a loaf stamped with a clumsy wolf. Sansa whispered each name before sleep, as if there were a god set to tally them. Arya dreamed of the city like a maze and woke smiling because she had found 3 ways out. The pact was grain and spears, but it had turned into something else. Into the sense that victories might come in shapes men did not expect, and that mercy might look like cunning if you stared at it only from above. In the months ahead, the dead would come and the living would assemble, some late, some early, some with too much hatred, some with too much hope. They would bring to the battle stories told over bread. They would bring the memory of doors saying no to power and yes to neighbors. They would bring children who had eaten enough to stand. They would bring fear and put it down long enough to lift spears. Cersei dreamed that night of a door and a locksmith whose face she could not make out. She woke with a taste of flour in her mouth and wanted to spit but did not. Jaime woke and watched the sky with eyes that had learned to see when clouds were lies. Qyburn wrote another list and made it neat because neatness is the consolation of little gods. Jon stood in snow that had not thought it would come to Dragonstone. He closed his eyes and heard in the flakes the sound of grain spilling, of bread cut, of men's boots, of a door's hinge saying nothing. The world was a series of hinges. It only took the right door saying no to change a house. He put his hand on the map table and it felt cold for the first time since he had laid palm to it. "You were right," he said to Tyrion, not looking at him. "A siege wasn't the way." "To be right," Tyrion said, "about hunger is not a gift. It is a penance yet to be paid." "Did we pay enough?" Jon asked. "Ask me when the dead are done counting us," Tyrion said. "Ask a child who ate. Ask a woman who did not bury her husband before we asked her to hold a spear. I cannot count that high, not even I." They did not know then what shape the northern fields would take under white. They did not know which men would run or which men would stand and be proud to be called fools later. They knew only that the South had been made to look away from itself long enough for the North to gather breath. They knew that bread had proved wiser than banners one more time. They knew that Dorne's spears, so often thrown at pride as if pride were a board to be nailed, had held instead at passes where cold would bite. They knew that a deed done with a map and a handful of connivance had made it so the first clash with death would not happen with a king's city gnashing its hunger like teeth against their backs. In the streets of King's Landing Mare baked, and when the flour came thinner she still baked, and when it thinned again, she cut slices and the city learned, slowly, to lean into one another. Sometimes a gold cloak would knock 3 times, and she would open and give him a half loaf and he would look ashamed and grateful as if those 2 things had married in him and were raising children. In the yard of the Red Keep, men drilled. In the corners of the city, men spoke in low voices. In quiet places where men take women's names as whispered prayers, lives went on. When the first ravens came with wings heavy from cold and eyes that had seen snow on sea, the city was not ready, but it was not as unready as it might have been. The watch sent men north in bunches like carrots pulled from a stubborn garden. The bakers sent bread south to camps that had never thought to eat city bread. Dorne sent spears that did not expect glory. The North sent a promise. Stand and we stand with you. Men who had been fed by a stranger's risk held spears more firmly because debt and bread are cousins. In the end, though it was not the end, it was not a clever plan or a noble speech that kept the city from tearing apart the men who asked it to hold. It was a door's refusal. It was bread shared in a line that had wanted to become a riot and decided against it because someone had put a warm weight into your hands. It was men who counted fewer ships and more faces. It was the knowledge that hunger had been turned against the proud, and pride had failed to turn it back into a weapon. It was a pact inked not only in letters to Sunspear and White Harbor but in the damp fingerprints left on tables where maps had been moved like chess and found to be weather. When Jon rode north at last with the weight he had chosen sitting on him like a second cloak, the wind took his hair and the dragon on the cliff watched with eyes that understood little of bread and much of fire. Tyrion stood and did not wave. He had never learned to wave convincingly. He held instead onto the notion that he had struck a blow without firing a bolt. He would answer for it, to gods or to ghosts or to his own memory in the long nights ahead. But for now, he stitched the tale in his mind and tried, with humility not always easy to find in himself, to make the stitches small and strong. And in a city whose bell once rang for a queen made of wildfire, a sergeant told his daughter that doors are made for closing as well as opening. The girl laughed and asked for bread. He cut it and gave her the larger piece because he had learned the trick of it, which is the beginning of every decent rule. Give the larger piece to the one who will need to stand longer. He thought of hunger as a lesson he had no wish to teach again. He thought of a wolf stamped badly in wax and decided that bad art can still bless. He thought, without quite knowing it, that he had been made a hinge and had not rusted.